bride nobody in town wanted to look at twice, a hog farmer everybody had already written off, and a marriage arranged by letter that was never supposed to be anything more than salt and labor. When Liesl Brandt stepped off the westbound train with one rope-bound trunk and maybe 40 English words to her name, the whole platform at Barrow Creek pitied her, and they pitied Gideon Marsh for sending away for her, because everyone knew his hog farm was one hard winter from belonging to the bank. Gideon had ordered a wife the way a man orders a barrel of coarse salt, because his hogs were ready for butchering, and there was no one left to work the smokehouse, and he expected nothing from her but 2 strong hands and silence. What he did not know, what nobody on that platform could have guessed, was that the quiet German girl in the patched wool dress had been raised in a butcher's family that had cured hams for 3 generations, and that she carried in her head a way with salt and smoke and time that would, before the wild plums bloomed, feed half of Kansas and change the whole accounting of his life. If you have ever been counted out before you got your chance, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments, because I want to see how far this story travels. It was November of 1882 in the low hog country south of Barrow Creek, Kansas, and the wind had been running out of the northwest for 3 days straight when the afternoon train came in an hour late with its windows already rimed at the corners. Liesl Brandt was 26 years old, and she had been traveling for 31 days, first on a ship out of Bremen that smelled of tar and sickness, then on trains that got smaller and dirtier and colder the farther west they went, until the last one was 2 cars and a coal tender rattling across a country so flat and so empty that she had pressed her hand to the window glass and wondered if God had finished making it, or simply run out of material. She came down the iron steps carefully, because the steps were icy and because everything she owned in the world was in the trunk behind her, and she stood on the platform in the wind with her shawl pulled tight and her chin level, and she waited. The men outside the freight office looked at her the way men look at weather, something to be assessed and remarked on and gotten out of. One of them said something low, and the others laughed, not cruelly exactly, but not kindly either. The laugh of men who have decided a thing is a shame and are relieved it is not their shame. She did not understand the words. She understood the laugh fine. Laughs did not need translating, and neither did pity, and she had made up her mind somewhere around the 2nd week of the ocean that she was done being on the receiving end of both. Gideon Marsh was late because the axle on the wagon had cracked that morning, which was the way of things that year, everything cracking, everything letting go 1 piece at a time, and he had wired it together with fence wire and driven the 9 miles into town with his jaw set against the cold and against the whole business of what he was driving in to do. He was 38 years old, and he looked older, the way men on the plains did, wind-burned and squint-lined, with gray coming into his beard ahead of schedule. He had buried his wife Nora 2 years back, in the June of 1880, of a fever that took her in 9 days, and since then the house had gone quiet in a way that was worse than empty, and the farm had gone downhill in a way he could measure in dollars. And he had finally done the arithmetic that 100 lonely men on that frontier did, and written to an agency in Kansas City, because hired help wanted wages he could not pay, and a wife wanted only her keep. He was not proud of the arithmetic. He was past the luxury of being proud of much. The agency letter had said she was German, healthy, of good character, willing to work, and that she came from a family in the meat trade, which was the only line in the letter Gideon had read twice, because a man with 41 hogs and no one to help at killing time reads a line like that twice. He came up the platform steps with his hat low and found her standing alone by her trunk, the last passenger left, and the first thing he thought, before he could stop himself, was that the agency had not said she was handsome, and the second thing he thought was that handsome was nothing to him now, and he made his face say so. She watched him come, a big man moving stiffly in a sheepskin coat, and she knew him at once, not from any photograph, because there had been none, but because he was the only man on that platform whose eyes were not laughing. He stopped an arm's length away and took off his hat, because his mother had raised him too, and the wind immediately tried to take it from his hands. He said her name, Liesel Brandt, pronouncing it wrong, and she said it back to him right, and then she said his, Gideon Marsh, pronouncing it carefully, the way she had practiced it on the train, and something about hearing his own name said with that much deliberate care in the middle of that much wind made him look at her a beat longer than he meant to. He said he had a wagon. She understood the word wagon. He took the trunk up onto his shoulder before she could reach for the rope handle, and she followed him down the steps, past the freight office and the men and their looks. And one of the men, a stock buyer named Edmund Vane, a neat man in a town coat with a gold watch chain and a way of smiling that never got near his eyes, tipped his hat to Gideon and said, "Well now, Marsh, I see you have taken on more stock." And the men behind him laughed again, and Gideon set the trunk in the wagon bed and turned around slowly and looked at Vane until the laugh dried up. And then he handed Liesel up onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her and drove out of town without a word. The marriage happened at the courthouse because the preacher was down with the grip and Gideon did not want to wait on him and feed another mouth for a week for the sake of ceremony. The clerk read the words too fast, and a deputy and the deputy's wife stood witness. And the deputy's wife cried a little, not out of joy but out of a general opinion about the proceedings, and Liesel heard the English words wash over her. Honor, keep, so long as you both shall live, and understood maybe 1 in 4 of them, and said the 2 words she had been told to say at the 2 places she had been told to say them, and it was done. Gideon signed the register in a careful hand. She signed hers below it, and he noticed, again before he could stop himself, that her signature was neat as printing, the hand of somebody who had been taught, and he filed that away with the line about the meat trade, in the small drawer of things about her that did not fit what he had ordered. The drive south took 2 hours, and the cold came up out of the ground as the light went, and neither of them said anything, because he had no words she knew, and she had no words he knew, and the wind would have eaten them anyway. She sat with her hands folded inside her shawl and watched the country, the frosted stubble fields, the far windmills, the cottonwoods along the creek bottoms standing bare as fence wire, and she did what she had done the whole way across the ocean and the whole way across the country behind it. She made herself look at what was actually there instead of what she was afraid of. What was actually there, when they came down the last swale as the sun went red behind them, was a low-frame house that had not been painted in years, a big gray barn leaning slightly out of true, a scatter of pens and chutes with the dark shapes of hogs moving in them, a windmill missing 2 blades, and off behind the barn, half swallowed in dead sunflower stalks, a small stout building of squared logs with a shake roof and a cold chimney, which she looked at longer than she looked at the house. Gideon saw her looking and said the only word of the drive. "Smokehouse," he said. She said the word back to him, breaking it in the middle, "Smokehouse," and then she said a word he did not know. "Rouch House," and nodded to herself like a woman checking an item off a list, and Gideon Marsh drove the last quarter-mile to the house with the strange and not entirely comfortable feeling of a man who has ordered a plow and begins to suspect he has been delivered an engine. The house inside was clean because he had scrubbed it in a fit of shame 2 days before, and it was bare because 2 years of selling off anything that would sell had made it bare, and it was cold because the fire had been banked since morning. He carried her trunk into the small back room that had been a sewing room in Nora's time, and set it down, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands again, working out how a man explains sleeping arrangements to a stranger he has married that afternoon when neither of them speaks the other's language. And Liesl took the matter out of his hands by simply nodding at the little room, and at the narrow bed in it, and saying, in her slow, careful English, "This is good." Then she walked past him to the kitchen, opened the firebox of the stove, found it laid but not lit, lit it, found the lamp, lit that, and tied on her apron, which she had carried across 4,000 miles, folded in the top of the trunk the way another woman might carry a wedding dress. Gideon stood in his own doorway and watched his own kitchen come to life around a woman he had known 5 hours. And the loneliness that had been living in that house like a tenant did not leave, but it moved back a room, the way a dog moves back from a fire that has just been fed. They ate fried mush and side pork that night, because that was what there was. And she ate the side pork slowly, thoughtfully, the way a jeweler looks at another man's stones, and after supper, while he sat with his ledger and his dread at the table, she washed up, banked the stove, said good night in English, and stopped in the door of the little back room, and said one more thing. Her one sentence she had built in advance, the way she had built his name. She said, "Tomorrow I see the pigs." It was not a question. Gideon Marsh sat with his pen over the sorry arithmetic of his life and listened to her door close softly, and for the first time in longer than he could account for, the last thing he felt before sleep was not dread. It was curiosity. The truth of the Marsh place came out over the next week the way frost comes out of the ground, slowly and in patches. The truth was this: Gideon Marsh owed the Farmers and Drovers Bank of Barrow Creek $640, due in full on the first day of April, secured against the land, the buildings, and the stock, and Howard Pruitt, who ran the bank from behind a desk the size of a farrowing pen, had made it courteously plain in September that there would be no further extensions, because there had already been 2. The note had started 3 years back as seed money and a new bore and repairs after the hailstorm of '79, and it had grown the way notes grow, quietly, in the dark, like anything you feed and never butcher. Against it, Gideon had 41 hogs, of which maybe 30 were prime or would be by Christmas, a wagon with a wired axle, a quarter section of good bottom land that he would have sold his own hands to keep, and the going price for dressed pork in Barrow Creek, which was the middle of the problem, because the going price in Barrow Creek was whatever Edmund Vane said it was. Vane bought stock and meat for shipment east, and he was the only buyer within a day's haul, and he ran his business off a big beam scale in his warehouse by the depot, and there was not a farmer in the county who had not stood by that scale and watched it read lighter than his own figuring and said nothing, because the next nearest market was Ellsworth, better than 40 miles of frozen ruts away, and Vane knew to the pound and to the mile exactly how much a desperate man will swallow. He had offered Gideon 3.5 cents a pound on the hoof in October, take it or haul it, and smiled his dry smile. And Gideon had done the arithmetic on 3.5 cents against $640 and found that it came out to losing the farm politely instead of rudely. That was the household Liesl Brandt had married into, though no one had written any of it in the agency letter, and she learned it not from Gideon, who would have sooner discussed his own funeral, but from Ott Kruger, the neighbor to the east, an old bachelor Prussian who had come to the county with the railroad gangs 20 years before and stayed, and who showed up the second morning with a sack of turnips as a wedding gift and nearly dropped them when the new Mrs. Marsh answered the door and greeted him in German. After that, Ott came by often, ostensibly to help with the heavy work, actually to talk, because he had been storing up German for 2 decades, and through Ott in her own tongue, Liesel got the whole ledger of her new life. The note, the date, the bank, Vane and his scale, the 2 extensions already spent, the dead wife, the good man gone quiet, all of it laid out. And Ott finished by patting her hand and telling her, kindly, in the way of old men who believe they are being comforting, that it was a hard place she had come to and nobody would think less of her for writing to the agency about a different situation. Because Marsh was a decent man, but this farm was going to the bank in the spring, everyone knew it, and there was no sense in a young woman going down with it. Liesel poured him more coffee and asked him a question that had nothing to do with any of that. She asked him where a person could buy salt in quantity, coarse salt, not table salt, and saltpeter, and brown sugar, and black pepper, and whether the winters here were steady cold or came and went, and Ott Kruger blinked at her, and answered, and then sat there with his cup halfway to his mouth, watching her write it all down in a small canvas notebook in a neat printed hand, and he told his dog that evening, in German, that Marsh had no idea what had gotten off that train. What had gotten off that train was the last of the Brants of Osnaburg, a family that had run a butcher shop and smokehouse on the same corner for 3 generations, whose Westphalian hams had gone to tables in Hamburg and Bremen, and once, her grandfather swore, to a bishop. And Liesel had grown up in the back of that shop the way other children grow up in orchards, knowing brine the way they knew apples, taught by her father who had no sons, everything his father had taught him, the dry cure and the wet, the counting of days by weight, the beechwood smoke kept thin and cool and patient for weeks, the reading of a ham by pressing it with a thumb, the whole quiet cathedral of salt and time. And then the cattle plague and the new tariffs had come through the province like weather, and the shop had failed in the panic, and her father had died of being a man whose work was taken from him, quickly, of nothing the doctor could name, and the creditors had taken the shop, the corner, the name off the window, and at the end of it there had been a notice in a Bremen paper about American men seeking wives, and Liesel Brandt, who had nothing left of 3 generations but her 2 hands and what was stored behind her eyes, had sat down and answered it. She did not tell Gideon any of this, partly because she did not yet have the English for it, but mostly because she had learned the hard way in Osnaburg that telling people what you can do is a coin that spends once, and showing them is a coin that spends forever. So she showed him. She started small, and she started, to Gideon's surprise, not in the kitchen but in the pens, walking the frozen mud in her heavy skirt at first light with her notebook, looking at hogs, and she looked at hogs the way Vane looked at scales. Professionally, she stood at the rail in the hard wind and sorted his 41 hogs with her eyes into the prime, the near, and the never. And when Gideon came out, she pointed and held up fingers and made him understand, in their patchwork language of gestures and her 40 words and his 3 words of German, which 12 she wanted fed differently, more corn, less slop. These 12, these, and Gideon Marsh, who had been raising hogs since he was a boy lifting feed pails with both hands, stood in his own pens being instructed by a woman pointing with a mittened hand, and found, examining himself with some astonishment, that he did not mind. Because the pointing was right. That was the thing. Every point was right. And a man who has been alone with a failing thing for 2 years knows the sound of right the way a freezing man knows the direction of a fire. The killing time came the last week of November when the cold set in to stay, and it was the first time they truly worked together. Gideon and Ott doing the heavy, bloody end of it at the barn, while Liesel commanded the scalding barrel and the tables like a small general. And it went hard and long, 4 days of steam and ache in the bitter air, and at the end of it there was more good pork hanging in the cold gray light of that barn than Gideon had ever had at one time in his life. This was the moment in every other year when Vane's wagon would come rolling into the yard with its scale weights, riding in a locked box like a magistrate, and the year's work would ride away for whatever mercy the beam showed. And this was the moment Liesel Brandt stood in front of the hanging pork, with her breath smoking and her arms crossed, and said to her husband of 3 weeks the longest English sentence she had yet attempted. She said, "No sell now." She said it, and then she stood there and worked at the rest of it, hunting the words one at a time like a woman picking dropped pins off a floor. And what she assembled, with Ott called over from the barn to carry the heavy end of the translating, was this: fresh pork in November is worth 3.5 cents, because every farm in Kansas has fresh pork in November. Cured ham in March. Real ham. Ham such as these people have never once tasted. Ham in the hungry end of winter, when the barrels are empty, and the railroad crews are cursing their salt junk, and the hotels in the cow towns are buying anything that does not move, that is not 3.5 cents. That is not the same animal. "Give me the Smokehouse," she said, through Ott. "Give me the salt and the time, and I will give you the note paid." Ott Kruger delivered this, and then added, on his own account, in English, "Marsh, I have eaten what her family made. They sold it in Bremen when I was a boy. My mother bought it for Christmas only." And Gideon looked back and forth between the old man and his own wife, standing in front of his own pork like a guard in an apron, and he thought about $640, and the 1st of April, and 3.5 cents, and he was quiet so long the steam stopped rising off the scalding barrel. Everything he had was hanging in that barn. If she was wrong, if the cure went bad, if the meat spoiled, or the market she promised was a dream she had carried over on the boat with her, then there was no second chance. No next year. Nothing between his family's land and Howard Pruitt's folder of papers. He looked at her a long time. She did not look away, and he had the feeling, which he would have all his life with her, that she was doing him the courtesy of letting him see all the way down, that there was no bottom to hit, just rock. "All right," he said at last, and his voice came out lower than he intended. "All right, we do it your way." And Liesel Brandt nodded once, the way her father had nodded over a handshake in Osnaburg, and turned to the pork and rolled up her sleeves in the freezing barn. And if there was any fear in her, and there was fear enough to fill the scalding barrel, she had it stowed where it did not show, because she was of the 3rd generation, and the 3rd generation does not weep in front of the meat. December settled in around the work like a lid on a kettle. The days took a shape that neither of them had planned, and both of them came to depend on, up in the dark, the stove, the pens, the cold room, where the hams lay ranked in their barrels, waiting out their appointed days. And Liesel moved through it all with the notebook riding in her apron pocket like a second heart, turning hams on their calendar, rubbing the cure into the faces of them, checking the cold room's temperature by the feel of the air on her cheek when she opened the door. Because her father had taught her that a thermometer tells you the number, and your face tells you the truth. Gideon watched her work the way you watch weather you do not understand yet. And he began, without quite deciding to arrange himself around it, hauling the 100-pound sacks so she would not, splitting the stove wood shorter because she liked a quicker fire, building her a salting table of his own design in the lean-to with a lip around the edge so the cure would not scatter. And when she ran her hand along that lip the morning she found it, and looked at him, and said, "This is good work," Gideon Marsh went out to the pens with his ears burning like a schoolboy's and was disgusted with himself, and whistled the whole time he forked the feed. The evenings were the school. It had started as necessity, because a farm runs on words, gate and barrel and Tuesday and how much, but it became the warmest hour of the day almost without their noticing. The two of them at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them and the wind doing its long work outside. Gideon with the newspaper or the seed catalog, Liesl with the family Bible Nora had left, because it was the only book in the house with big print. And she would read out a verse in her slow, careful way, hunting each word like a woman picking pins off a floor, and he would say the hard ones for her. Wilderness, righteousness, inheritance, and she would say them back, and write them in the notebook on the page facing the brine counts, so that all her life afterward her English lived next door to her salt, which she said once, years later, was the correct arrangement since both of them were for preserving things. Some evenings she asked about words the Bible did not have. She pointed one night at the empty chair by the window, the one nobody used, and said hers, and it was not a question, and Gideon did not pretend it was one. He said hers, and after a while, looking at the stove door, he told her about Nora, a little. The way a man lets water out of a pond he has been holding all year, carefully, watching the level, that she had been from Ohio, that she sang at the church, that the fever took her in 9 days in the June of 1880, and the doctor never did name it to his satisfaction, and Liesl listened with her hands still on the table, and did not say she was sorry, because she had only 40 words and would not spend them on the ones everyone spends, and instead, when he was done, she got up and moved the empty chair from the window to the table, into the lamplight, into the family, and set her mending basket on it, and sat back down, and Gideon Marsh looked at the chair and looked at his hands and could not speak for a while. And that was the night he stopped writing the agency's address on the flyleaf of his ledger, which he had been doing, in weak moments, in case she gave it up and went. The first town trip together came the week before Christmas, because the cure wanted more pepper and Feeney's account wanted paying, and it went the way she had known it would go, and he had hoped it would not. The store was warm and full, farmers in for winter goods, women at the yard goods counter, and the talk dropped by half when the Marshes came in, and picked back up carrying that particular bright false note a room makes when it has just changed the subject. And at the counter, the stock buyer's wife in the fur collar looked at Liesl's mended mittens with a long, thorough kindness, and said, loudly enough that it must be such a comfort for Mr. Marsh to have help out there through the winter, leaning on the word help the way you lean on a gate you intend to swing. And the store held its breath pleasantly, and Gideon Marsh, who had said maybe 40 public words that year, set the pepper and the paid account book on the counter, and said, in a voice that was not loud and did not need to be, my wife makes the finest cured meat between here and the old country, and come March this county is going to know it, and until then any man or woman who wants to discuss my household can discuss it with me. And he picked up the parcel, and gave the room good afternoon, and held the door for Liesl like a deacon. And the cold came in the door, and the subject did not change back after they left. Liesl said nothing until the wagon was past the depot, and then she said, thickly, looking straight ahead, you spent many words, and Gideon said, they keep, meaning the words, meaning he had been saving them, and she laughed once in the freezing air, the first time he had heard it, a short, bright, astonished sound like ice letting go of a pump handle, and he spent the 9 miles home trying to think how to cause it again. Christmas week brought the Tillmans, and the Tillmans were the other schooling of that winter. They were renters on the poor ground west of Otts, a wagon load of children, and a milk cow in bad luck. And the man had broken his arm shucking in November, green set by the cheap doctor. And 2 days before Christmas, the oldest Tillman boy walked the 4 miles to the marsh place with his ears wrapped in a scarf that had been a flour sack, and stood in the yard too proud to knock, and pretended he had come about borrowing a crosscut saw. Liesel fed him at the kitchen table until he stopped being able to pretend. 3 eggs and fried mush and side meat, watching him the way she had watched hungry children in the panic years in Osnabrück. And then she loaded the wagon herself. Sausage trimmings, cracklings, a sack of meal, the second best flitch of bacon, and drove it over the frozen ruts with the boy beside her. And when the Tillman woman came out to the fence with her chin already stiffening up to refuse it, Liesel handed the reins to the boy, climbed down, and said the sentence she had made ought teach her on purpose 2 days before. In English, plain, we are neighbors. This is not charity. At hog killing your boy's work for me, and we are even. And the Tillman woman looked at her a long moment, wind snapping both their skirts, and then nodded. The short nod of the poor accepting terms they can live with. And that spring, and every spring after there, were Tillman boys in the marsh pens at wages. And years later, one of them owned a butcher shop in Salina, with her counts written in the back of his ledger. And if you want the accounting of a life, that is also in it. The letter from Germany came between Christmas and the New Year, forwarded twice, gray with handling, from her mother's sister in Osnabrück. And Liesel read it standing by the window in the sewing room that was hers, and Gideon, passing the door with an armload of stove wood, saw her face and stopped. And she said, "Level, my mother's grave has been moved, the churchyard. They built through it, the new street goes through it, and there was nothing in the English she had for the rest of that. The shop gone, the name off the window, and now even the ground, the whole of Osnabrück closing over her family like water over a stone. And Gideon Marsh stood in the doorway with his stove wood and did not say it would be all right, because he was not a liar, and did not touch her, because it was not yet a house where they touched. And instead he said, slowly, so she could take each word, 'What was your mother's name?' And she said, 'Margarethe.' And he said it back, getting it nearly right, 'Margarethe,' and nodded as if entering it somewhere permanent, and carried his wood in to the stove. And that spring, without a word beforehand, he planted a white lilac at the corner of the yard where the evening sun caught, because Ott had let it slip that there had been one by the shop door in Osnabrück. And he never said what it was, and she never asked, and it outlived them both. And the Tillman boys' grandchildren, driving past the old marsh place with their windows down in some May of another century, would slow the car for the smell of it without ever once knowing why the air of a Kansas section line should be sweet with the doorway of a butcher shop 4,000 miles gone. That was the winter, if you are keeping the ledger of such things that the house finished changing sides. It had been his house with her in it. Somewhere between the moved chair and the spent words and the lilac that was not yet planted but already decided, it became theirs, and neither of them marked the day, because there was no day. There was only the long stack of small ones, which is the only way that particular door ever opens. The smokehouse had not been used properly in years, and the first thing she did was clean it the way surgeons clean, scraping the old rancid creosote from the racks, burning sulfur in the closed dark of it to kill what lived in the corners, rechinking the gaps between the logs with clay and ash until the draft pulled only where she wanted it to pull. From the low vent by the floor, up past the racks, and out the chimney in a thin, unhurried ribbon. Gideon watched her test that draft with a candle flame on a still evening, crouched in the doorway with her skirt gathered, watching the flame lean, moving a shingle over the vent a half-inch at a time, and he understood that he was watching a kind of literacy, that the building he had used all his life for hanging meat over a smudge was, in her hands, an instrument. Then came the salt. She had sent to town with aught and most of the butter and egg money for coarse salt in 100-pound sacks, and saltpeter from the druggist, who wanted to know what for, and was told hams, and went home and told his wife the German woman was going to lose Marsh what little he had left, and brown sugar and pepper, and she built her cure in the lean to off the kitchen by lamplight, measuring by handfuls that were not casual handfuls, her lips moving in German, weighing on the little brass balance she had carried in her trunk wrapped inside the apron, her father's balance, one of 3 things of his she had gotten out before the creditors came. The balance, the notebook, and a boar bristle brush with a cracked handle, and none of the 3 would have brought 50 cents at auction, and she would not have sold them for $50. She rubbed the cure into each ham by hand, into every face and fold of it, around the bone where spoilage starts, working like a woman washing a child, and she packed them in the cold room in clean barrels in ranks by weight, heaviest lowest, and turned and re-rubbed them on a calendar that lived in her head, this many days per pound, no more, never less. And Gideon, who had salted pork all his life the way you shovel grain, watched the care and thought it excessive, and said nothing, and was wrong, and would learn all winter exactly how wrong. The bacons went to the sweet cure, the shoulders and jowls to the plain. The trimmings became sausage on the coldest days, seasoned from her notebook, smoked small and quick, and it was the sausage that broke the town first, because sausage is fast. She sent a basket of it in with aught the 2nd week of December, not as charity and not as advertisement, though it was both, but as payment to Feeney at the mercantile against the spring account, and Feeney, who had taken the basket with the long-suffering face of a merchant accepting eggs and rutabagas in a cash-short county, ate 1 link warm off his stove iron that evening, stood a moment in the empty store, and then locked the door and took the basket home, where his family could not be witnessed. He was back at the farm inside a week, with actual money, asking for whatever there was more of, and after him came the doctor's wife, and after her the station master, and by Christmas week there was a plain fact establishing itself in Barrow Creek kitchen by kitchen, the way plain facts do, underneath the talk and contrary to it, and the fact was that the pitied German bride out at the Marsh place made the best thing anyone in that county had ever put in their mouth. The talk itself took longer to turn, because talk protects its investments. At church, where Liesel sat straight-backed and understood 1 word in 5, the women were cordial to her face and merciless in the churchyard, and the general line, led by a stock buyer's wife in a fur collar, was that it was a sad come-down for a man's farm to be riding on foreign sausage, and that Marsh had bought himself a servant and was calling it a marriage, and some of that talk found its way back to the farm, as it was intended to, by way of Dorcas Meeks, the widow neighbor to the north, who repeated it at the kitchen table with her eyes bright, in the manner of a woman delivering bad news as a gift, and watched for the German girl to flinch. Liesel understood more than she showed by then. She had been taking English off Gideon all winter, like a woman filling a jar a spoonful at a time, at supper, over harness mending, in the pens, and what she did with Dorcas Meeks was pour her more coffee and cut her a slice of the trial ham, the small one, the first one she judged ready, and set it in front of her without 1 word, and Dorcas Meeks ate it, and stopped talking, and looked at her plate, and Liesel said, in her slow, deliberate English, with the accent she would carry all her life, "Tell them that." Christmas came thin but not cold in the house. Gideon cut a hackberry sapling because there was no fir within 40 miles, and was embarrassed by it, a grown man dragging a bare twig into a kitchen. And Liesel dressed it with strings of dried apple and paper stars folded from an old catalog, and one tin candle holder from the bottom of her trunk. And on Christmas Eve, she cooked a goose ot brat and a red cabbage and sang, quietly, half to herself, in German, a song her mother had sung in the back of the shop in Osnabrück. And Gideon Marsh sat in his chair by the stove in the lamplight with his ledger unopened on his knee, and listened to a language he did not speak fill up a house he had thought was finished. And he looked at her across the room for a long time, and she felt it and looked up, and neither of them said anything, and both of them knew, in the way you know weather is changing before any cloud shows, that the arrangement was becoming something the courthouse clerk had not read out. In January the hard test came, as hard tests come, at 2 a.m. A norther dropped the bottom out of the sky the second week of the year, the kind of cold that cracked the pump handle and made the nails pop in the siding like pistol shots, and in the worst of it, the best of the brood sows went down sick. The big spotted one whose spring litter was the seed of every plan they had, off her feed, then down, then shaking, and Gideon and Liesel spent 3 nights in the barn with her in shifts, and then together, lanterns hung on the harness pegs, hot mash, blankets off their own beds, Liesel's remedies out of the notebook, bran and charcoal and warm beer that Ott donated to medicine with visible grief. And the third night, the breaking night, when the sow finally took the mash from Liesel's hand and held it down and slept, the two of them sat side by side on the feed box in the lantern light, wrapped in the same horse blanket because there was only one dry one left, too tired to keep the space between them they had kept all winter. And Gideon, staring straight ahead at the sleeping sow, said, "Nora and I lost the whole herd in 77, cholera, every head, and I stood right there where you are standing and swore I was done with this place, and Liesel, when the silence had gone on long enough that he thought she had not followed it, said in Osnabrück, when the shop failed, my father stopped eating. And I could not make him, and those 2 sentences, laid down side by side in the cold at 3 a.m, were the most either of them had ever said to anyone about any of it, and neither one moved away from the other's shoulder. And the lantern hissed, and the sow slept, and outside the wind went on hunting along the eaves, and that was the night, both of them agreed long afterward, though neither said a word of it at the time, that the contract quietly died, and something else took over the paper. February was smoke. The hams came out of the salt on their appointed days, were soaked and scrubbed and hung to form their pellicle in the cold draft of the barn alley, and then the smokehouse filled, rank on rank, and Liesel began the long patience that was the heart of everything her family had ever known. Beechwood there was none, but Ott's Grove had hickory and white oak, and she tried both and married them, and she kept that smoke thin and cool and steady for weeks, day on day, banking the little fire at night, reading the drip and the sheen and the smell at the door each morning the way Pruitt read his papers, and the smell of it drifted out over the section lines, and men driving the road to town lifted their faces like hounds as they passed the marsh place, and at the last fence post some of them stopped pretending they had business elsewhere and just turned up the lane and asked. By the last week of February she had sold, from the farm door, at prices that made Gideon look twice at the coins on the table, every sausage, every jowl, half the bacon flitches, and 3 hams, and she had turned away buyers for the rest, which Gideon thought was madness, and said so. The note was due in 5 weeks, and there was money standing in the yard asking to be taken, and Liesel shook her head and said the sentence she had been building toward all winter. "These are not for Barrow Creek," she said. "These are for the railroad." Edmund Vane had spent the winter watching all of this the way a man watches a fence line move on a survey he thought was settled. He had counted on the Marsh place. That was the plain commerce of it. He held no paper on Gideon, but he had an understanding with Howard Pruitt, the comfortable kind that never needs writing down, whereby Vane knew which farms were coming to the bank and when, and stood ready to buy the stock cheap at the sale, and the Marsh Quarter section, with its bottom land and its water, was the piece he wanted most in the county, and he had been waiting for the 1st of April the way other men wait for Christmas. And now there was smoke rising off the Marsh Smokehouse week after week like a flag he could not read, and coins going across Feeney's counter that never touched his scale, and his own dinner guests at his own table asking his own cook why her ham was not like the German woman's. And Edmund Vane put down his fork one evening in the last of February and decided the thing had gone far enough. He went at it the way he went at everything, indirectly, with clean hands. First came the talk, seated in the right places, at the depot, in the barber shop, a word here about how you could never be sure what went into foreign sausage, a wondering there about whether the county had ever inspected that smokehouse, whether hogs that had been sick in January ought to be feeding half the town in February. Nothing accusatory, nothing a man could be called out on, just the small cold drops of doubt that a patient man lets fall into a town's water. And some of it took, because doubt is cheap, and the winter was long, and a few farm door buyers stopped coming, and at church 2 women moved their market baskets to the other arm when Liesel passed, and Liesel, who had watched exactly this weather destroy her father, said nothing at home about the tightness at the corner of her own mouth, and doubled the scrubbing of an already spotless smokehouse, and lay awake. Then came the bank. On the 4th day of March, Howard Pruitt sent a boy out to the farm with a courteous note asking Mr. Marsh to call at his earliest convenience. And Gideon rode in through a gray thaw and sat in the leather chair and listened to Pruitt explain, with his fingertips together and his eyes going everywhere except across the desk, that the bank had reviewed its spring position, that there was concern. He would not say whose about he searched delicately the unconventional plan of finance out at the Marsh property, and that while the note's date stood at the 1st of April, the bank wished him to understand that there would be no allowance of even days this year, the full $640 by close of business that day, or the papers would go to the courthouse on the 2nd. And further, Pruitt regretted, the bank could not see its way to accepting inventory, meaning meat, meaning her work, as any part of payment cash only, and Gideon Marsh sat very still in the leather chair and understood 2 things at once, that Vane's hand was in this to the wrist, and that being right about it was worth nothing at all. 27 days. He rode home the 9 miles in the gray thaw and told her at the kitchen table plainly, all of it. And this too was new, that he brought the wound home and set it on the table instead of carrying it out to the barn alone. And Liesel listened with her hands flat on the table on either side of her coffee. And when he was done, she was quiet a while. And then she asked one question. She asked how much the railroad hotel in Ellsworth fed in a day. Gideon said he had no idea. Ott, when they fetched him, did have an idea, because Ott had graded that roadbed 20 years before and had eaten in the beanery it grew from, and his idea was 200 plates a day when the trains ran, more when the stock cars were moving, and the eating house had a manager, a Mr. Corbin, who had come from a Chicago hotel and complained, publicly and often, that between Kansas City and Denver a man could not buy a piece of cured meat fit to set before a paying customer. Liesel stood up from the table and took down the notebook and the brass balance and said, "We go to Ellsworth." Gideon said it was better than 40 miles, that the march roads were half ice and half bog, that the wagon axle was wired, that they could lose the whole cargo to one wreck or one warm day, and that if Ellsworth said no, there was no time left to try anything else, they would come home to the sale bill. Liesel said, in her slow, careful English, "All the things you say are true," and stood there with the notebook held against her chest like a breastplate, and waited. And Gideon Marsh looked at his wife across the kitchen he had once meant to hand to the bank with the least possible fuss. And then he went out into the sleet without another word, and started pulling the wired axle to fit the spare Ott had been promising all winter. And if you had asked him to name the moment he stopped being a man salvaging a defeat and became a man in a fight, he would have named that one. They loaded on the 12th of March in the dark before dawn, the 11 remaining hams sewn each in clean muslin, then in burlap, packed in straw in the wagon box like eggs, the flitches of bacon in barrels, the last kegs of sausage, everything the winter had made that had not already gone to keep faith with the note. $640 riding on straw. And they went together, Gideon driving, Liesel wrapped beside him with the balance in her lap, Ott left behind to do the chores and stand guard on the smokehouse, and the trip took 2 days going. One night at a road ranch, where they slept sitting up on either side of the freight, and the roads were exactly as bad as promised, and at the smoky hill crossing the ice groaned under the wheels like a door in an empty house, and neither of them breathed from bank to bank. Ellsworth was noise after a winter of wind, engines and stock pens and mud streets full of men, and the eating house by the depot was a long white building with steam on its windows. And Mr. Corbin turned out to be a small, quick man with a Chicago collar and no time, who received them in a storeroom between the arrival of 2 trains, with his watch open in his hand, and said he bought from Packers on contract, "Thank you," and had no use for farm-cured country meat. None. The last lot had been green in the middle and half rust. Good day. And Liesel Brandt, who had crossed an ocean on exactly one door opening after 100 had shut, did not argue a word. She unsewed the smallest ham on his storeroom table without asking, cut from the center of it with her father's knife, and laid the slice on the blade and held it out. And the smell of it went out into that storeroom the way spring goes into a valley. And Mr. Corbin of Chicago looked at the deep rose center and the clean white rim of it, and put his watch away, and ate. And then he stood there a moment, with his eyes somewhere else, and what he said when he said anything was, "Madam, where in the state did you learn to do this?" And Liesel said, "Not in this state, in Westphalia." And Corbin pulled out a chair for her, with his own hands. The trains came and went twice while they talked, and the talking was hard and quick and to Liesel's liking. A man who knew what things cost and said so, and by lamplight that evening it was written and signed on eating house paper. The Corbin house took every pound in the wagon at 14 cents for the hams and 9 for the bacon, cash on the barrelhead, which came, when Corbin's clerk had run the figures twice because Corbin made him, to $411, and beneath that, in Corbin's Chicago hand, a standing contract, all the cured meat the Marsh Smokehouse could deliver through the coming year at prices fixed to the Kansas City quotation, with the eating house's freight allowance, for as long as the quality held as sampled. And Corbin, blotting it, said the sentence that they would repeat to each other on bad days for the next 30 years. He said, "Quality like this does not come from a county. It comes from a person. And I am contracting with the person." They drove home through better weather with $411 sewn into Liesel's coat and the contract flat inside the family Bible. and they did not talk much, because there was too much to say. But somewhere in the second afternoon, on a long, empty stretch, with the meadow larks starting up out of the fence rows, the first ones of the year, Gideon said, without preamble, out over the horse's ears, I did not believe you, back in November. I said all right, but I did not believe you. I want you to know it now, while things are still hard. So it counts. And Liesel Brandt looked out over the same horse's ears at the same brown country, her country now, and said, I know it. You gave me the Smokehouse anyway. That is worth more than believing. And they rode on into Barrow Creek and up the main street past Vane's warehouse with their empty wagon rattling like a drum, and Edmund Vane stood in his own doorway under his own painted sign and watched them pass, and counted, being a professional, the barrels that were not in that wagon, and went back inside and shut the door. And the men loafing by the depot noticed that too. And the town, which had been holding its breath over the marsh place all winter without admitting it cared, let it out in a low whistle. $229 was still wanting, with 18 days left, and what happened next was the part nobody planned, least of all Liesel. Because the story of the storeroom in Ellsworth came back up the line ahead of them, the way stories travel on railroads, in the cabs and the cabooses, told by Corbin's own clerk to a conductor, and by the conductor to everyone a conductor talks to. And the shape the story took was the shape the country wanted, the German bride they laughed at, the ham that stopped a Chicago man mid-watch, and before the end of the week, there were strangers turning up the marsh lane. A hotel man from Salina, a mine agent's buyer, clear from Colorado on his way east, who had heard it at the Ellsworth depot and got off his own train to come see, and Dorcas Meeks, standing in the yard she had once carried poison into, telling anyone who would listen that she had eaten it first, before all of them. And Liesel sold the last of the winter's bacon off the smokehouse racks at prices she set herself, and did not blush at. And on the 26th day of March, 5 days early, Gideon Marsh walked into the Farmers and Drovers Bank in his church coat with his wife on his arm, and counted out onto Howard Pruitt's desk, in front of Howard Pruitt's clerk and God and everybody, $640 in full, and asked, politely, for the note and the mortgage release, marked paid, and a receipt. And Pruitt supplied all three with the expression of a man passing a kidney stone. And Liesel took the papers, read them slowly, top to bottom, in English, taking her time, the whole bank silent around her, and then nodded once and put them in her bag, and said, "Danky." And they walked out into the March sun of a street where every window held a face, and not one of the faces was laughing. The days after the note was paid had a strange floating quality, like the first days after a long fever breaks, when the body keeps bracing for a weight that is no longer there. Gideon caught himself twice that week starting the old arithmetic at the kitchen table, the reflex of 3 years, and stopping with the pen in the air over figures that no longer needed him. And Liesel watched him do it and understood it better than he did, because she had seen her father in the years when the shop still prospered wake at 4 out of habit long after there were journeymen to open, and she knew that worry is a hired man who does not leave just because the work is done. You have to pay him off slowly, season by season. The town came to them that spring, in ones and twos, wearing errands. Howard Pruitt himself drove out in April in his buggy with the folding top, ostensibly about a matter of the released mortgage's recording fee, actually to stand in the yard in his town shoes and mend what could be mended. And he made a small, heavy speech about how the bank had always believed in the fundamental soundness of the Marsh operation, and Gideon let it run its course the way you let a March shower run. And at the end of it, Liesel, who had come out wiping her hands, asked Pruitt with perfect courtesy whether the bank bought its hams anywhere particular, and Pruitt said he supposed from Feeney's, whatever Feeney carried. And Liesel said, "Then you have been eating mine since February." And Pruitt looked at his shoes and laughed, honestly, for the first time in that yard, and ordered 2 for the bank's 4th of July dinner and paid cash, and drove off, and Gideon watched the buggy shrink down the lane and said, wonderingly, to the yard in general, "I have known that man 20 years, and that is the first time I ever saw him pay for anything he could not foreclose on." And Liesel said, without looking up from her hands, "Everyone is better away from their scale," which entered the family language on the spot and stayed there 60 years. The first big Corbin order of the new season came up the line in early May, double the winter's rate, with a note in the Chicago Hand saying the summer tourist cars were adding a dining service, and the Corbin house meant to be famous for one thing on that timetable and had selected its thing, and the order set off the first genuine scramble of the new life, because fame eats faster than it pays. And the winter's meat was gone, and the spring hogs were months from prime, and Liesel sat down with the notebook and the calendar and did the arithmetic of smoke, days per pound, pounds per rack, racks per month, and came up short, and said so out loud at the supper table, plainly, the way she said everything, "We cannot fill this from our own pens. Not this year, maybe not any year if it grows." And there it was, the fork in the road that every good small thing comes to. Stay small and safe and turn away the future, or grow and depend on other people's work, other people's corn, other people's honesty. And Gideon, who had depended on nobody in living memory because everybody he depended on had died or failed him, sat with it a long while, and then said, "All right, whose hogs do we trust?" And the saying of whose instead of whether was, Liesel told Anna decades later, the bravest thing she ever heard at that table, though at the time she only nodded and turned to a clean page and wrote at the top, in her printed hand, the 2 words that became the ledger, that became the yard: Good Farms. Ott's name went first, which surprised no one, and the Tillman's second, which surprised the county, and through May and June Gideon rode fence lines he had not ridden in years, looking at other men's hogs with Liesel's eyes riding along in his head, corn-fed, clean-penned, honestly weighed, and made his offers plain and his prices posted, and the farms he chose prospered and knew why, and the ones he passed over asked what was wanted and were told, without ceremony. And most of them fixed it, because a posted price is a school teacher, and by midsummer there were wagons in the marsh yard on Saturdays and a set of certified scales on a built stand where every seller could watch the beam swing, and small boys sat on the fence rails to watch the weighing the way boys elsewhere watched trains. And the yard on those mornings had a sound Gideon had never heard on his own land in his life, the sound of many people profitably busy, which is a kind of music if your land has been quiet long enough. Liesel wrote to Osnaburg that summer, the long letter she had been not writing since November, to her mother's sister, and it took her 4 evenings at the kitchen table, and she wrote it in German, but she thought some of it in English now, and had to translate herself back to herself, which told her something about what was happening to her that the mirror had not. And in it she set down the plain facts: the husband, the land, the smokehouse, the contract, the note paid. And then she sat a long time over the closing and finally wrote the true sentence, the one she had crossed the ocean to be able to write someday: "Tell anyone who asks that the Brants are still in the meat trade," and sealed it before she could improve it into something smaller. And Gideon walked it to the depot himself and mailed it, and asked the station master casually how long a letter took to reach Germany, and was told 3 weeks with luck, and nodded, and stood on the platform a moment, the same platform, looking down the shining rails east, thinking about everything that had come up them into his life, and then went home to it. It would be tidy to say the fear was gone that summer, and it would be false. The fear changed jobs, is what it did. It stopped guarding the door and started walking the rows the way her father's had. Is the smoke too warm? Is the June too wet? Will the quality hold as sampled? And some nights Liesel still woke at 3 with her heart going and lay in the dark cataloging hams by weight until it settled. And some evenings Gideon still stood at the yard gate counting what could be lost. But they had learned the trick of it by then, which is that fear kept in a married house is like fire kept in a smokehouse. You do not put it out. You bank it. You keep it small and cool and working. And you never, ever leave it alone with everything you have. And on the clear evenings that summer, with the supper dishes done and the light going long in gold across the stubble, the two of them took up a habit that lasted the rest of their lives, and that the children and then the grandchildren were raised to step around and leave be. They walked out together to the smokehouse, not for any work. The day's work was done, and stood a while at the door of the little log building that had carried the whole weight of everything. The note, the winter, the doubt, the two of them, and smelled the cool tar-sweet dark of it, and said nothing much, and walked back. And if the county ever wondered what the marshes talked about out there in the dusk, the answer, most evenings, was nothing at all. Because past a certain depth a marriage does its accounting in silence, and theirs, by that first summer, already ran deeper than the words either language kept. You might think that was the whole victory, and by the ledger it was. But ledgers are not lives. And the truest part of this story happened 3 evenings later, in the kitchen, over nothing. It was raining the first real rain of spring, drumming soft on the shakes, and supper was cleared, and Gideon sat oiling a harness strap he did not need to oil, and Liesel sat with the notebook, planning the spring litters and the fall smoke in her printed hand, and the lamp hissed between them, and Gideon put the strap down and said her name, just her name, Liesel, which in 5 months he had almost never used. And she looked up and he had trouble with the next part, and she waited, and let him have trouble, and what came out, when it came rough and in pieces, like a wall being taken down by hand. He said, I wrote to that agency for a hired girl I would not have to pay. That is the truth of what I did, and you know it, and you knew it when you got off the train, and you came anyway, and you worked like 2 men, and you saved this place that was never yours to save. And I have been sitting in this kitchen all winter, watching you, and what I feel is not what a man feels about hired help, and it has not been for a long time, and I do not know the words for asking a woman for what is already legally mine. But I am asking anyway. I am asking whether you could ever look at this, at me, and see something you would have chosen, if choosing had been offered you. He got all the way through it looking mostly at the harness strap. The rain filled up the quiet afterward. And Liesel Brandt closed the notebook and was still a moment. And then she answered him in the way that was hers, plainly, without decoration, each word set down like a weight on the brass balance. She said, when my father died, I decided love was a thing that had been possible in the old country and was not possible for me anymore. And I answered the notice the way you wrote it. Work for keep. And I thought, this is sensible, this is enough. I am done wanting more than enough. And then I watched you give me the smokehouse when you did not believe, and stand up from that scalding barrel 4 days without one complaint, and look at that man Vane on the platform the first hour I knew you when I had no words yet, and make him stop laughing at a stranger you had known 10 minutes. You have been choosing me all winter, Gideon, every day, in the way you are, without noise. So yes, If choosing is offered now, I choose it back. And then, because the moment had gotten larger than either of them knew how to stand in, she added in the dry voice she kept for her best jokes, "Also, your Smokehouse and I are not to be separated now. It would not be practical." And Gideon Marsh laughed, really laughed, for the first time in that kitchen in 3 years, and reached across the lamp and took her hand. Salt cracked, brine scarred, the strongest hand he had ever held. And that was the whole of the scene. No speech, no kneeling, 2 tired people, and a hissing lamp and the rain. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the plain gold that all the counterfeit versions are struck to imitate. They were married again in June, properly this time, by the recovered preacher in the whitewashed church with the doors open to the smell of cut hay. Not because the courthouse paper wanted improving, but because, as Gideon said, the first time the county watched us sign a contract, and I would like the county to watch us mean it. And the church was full, which would have astonished anyone who had stood on that train platform in November. And Ott Kruger gave the bride away with his beard trimmed and his eyes wet, muttering in German that he had told his dog all along how it would end. And afterward in the churchyard the same women who had shifted their baskets moved through, the crowd to stand near her, the way people move toward a fire in the fall, not apologizing, exactly, because towns rarely apologize, but warming their hands, and Liesel let them. She had learned that from watching Gideon with a green colt. You do not make the shy ones pay for coming in late. You open the gate and stand quiet. There remained the matter of Edmund Vane, and it settled itself the way such men's matters usually do, not with a showdown, but with a scale. Because the farmers of that county, watching the Marsh place all winter, had taken away a lesson that had nothing to do with ham, which was that Vane's price was not weather after all, not something that simply happened to you out of the sky, and that a person with nerve and a wagon could drive past him, and that spring a dozen of them did, hauling to Ellsworth in 2s and 3s for company on the road, and the Corbin house and the yards there paid them honestly. And worse for Vane, Liesel had shown Feeney and Ott and anyone else who asked the trick of her brass balance and a set of certified weights she ordered from Kansas City. And one Saturday in May, in front of his own warehouse, a crowd of farmers politely asked Vane to weigh a sack of proved 50-pound weights on his big beam. And the beam said 46, and it said it in front of 40 witnesses and the county attorney, whom somebody had thought to invite. There was no trial worth the name, a fine, a license lost, and it did not matter, because the verdict that ruined him had already come in at kitchen tables all over the county. By August his warehouse stood empty, with the gold letters peeling off the sign, and by the next spring he was gone altogether. To Wichita, they said, and the only monument he left in Barrow Creek was a saying that lasted a generation. Whenever any man promised more than he could prove, folks would squint and say, "Weigh it on Vane's scale," and spit, and that was all the revenge anyone took. And Liesel always held it was plenty. "Revenge," she said once to Dorcas Meeks, "is like the fire in a smokehouse. A little, kept cool and far from the meat, does the work. More than that, and you are only burning your own winter." The farm turned that year like a wagon coming out of a rut, all at once and with a lurch you could feel. The spotted sow they had nursed through the January night raised 11 pigs, and the spring litters ran to 43 head all told, and Gideon put the note money that no longer went to Pruitt into fencing the bottom land for hogs and into 2 bred gilts of better blood from a breeder up at Abilene. And Liesel took on Dorcas Meeks's eldest girl for wages, the first help the Marsh place had ever hired instead of borrowed, and taught her the way her father had taught, hands over hands in the brine barrel, saying the counts out loud, And when the girl asked her, in the innocent brutality of 16, whether it was true she had come to Kansas with nothing, Liesel considered the question honestly and said, "No. Nobody comes with nothing. I came with everything my people knew. It just does not show at the depot the county fair that 1st September was the public coronation, though nobody used such a word in Barrow Creek, where the highest known praise was that a thing would do." The fair ran 3 days on the trampled grass east of town. Horse races and pie tables and a brass band of 7 that knew 5 tunes. And the premium classes for home curing had been won for 9 straight years by the stock buyer's wife with the fur collar, whose hams were, in the general opinion nobody had ever tested, very fine. And Liesel had not intended to enter at all, on the grounds that she cured meat for money and it seemed poor manners to bring a cannon to a church raffle. But Dorcas Meeks entered her, filling out the card herself at Feeney's counter with the happy thoroughness of a reformed sinner doing good works. And by the time Liesel found out, the premium list was printed, and withdrawing would have been a louder statement than losing. So on the second morning of the fair, a marsh ham went up on the long table under the canvas with 11 others, plain, unribboned, sewn in its muslin the way they went to Ellsworth, and the judge that year was, by the fair board's nervous compromise, not anybody from the county at all, but the dining conductor off the noon train. A heavy, dignified man who judged food for a living whether anyone appointed him or not, and he went down that table with a borrowed knife, cutting and considering, in a silence that got deeper as he went. And when he came to the marsh ham, he cut it, and looked at it and smelled the knife, and then he did the thing the county talked about clear into the next decade. He stopped judging, and simply ate, standing there, 4 slices, with his eyes shut, in front of the fair board and the band, and the stock buyer's wife and God, and everybody. And then he asked, in the voice of a man in church, "Who in this county made this?" And 200 people turned and looked at Liesel Brandt Marsh, where she stood at the edge of the canvas with her hands folded, and the ribbon they gave her was blue. And the sentence the conductor said after was worth more than the ribbon. He said, "Madam, I have eaten in every eating house from Kansas City to Denver, and I have never been served the equal of this anywhere on the line," and the line was the ribbon. As far as the county was concerned, the line was the whole world going by at 40 miles an hour. And one of their own had just been declared its best table, and Barrow Creek, which had pitied her off the train platform 10 months before, stood under that canvas and applauded her until the band, feeling something was wanted, struck up one of its 5 tunes and got the wrong one, and nobody cared. The stock buyer's wife came to her afterward, which took a kind of courage too, fur collar and all, and stood a moment rearranging her gloves, and said stiffly that it was a worthy ham, and then in a lower voice, with the first honest thing she had ever handed across, that her own grandmother had cured in the old style back in Pennsylvania, and she had never once been able to get the middle right. It went dry on her every year, every single year, and Liesel, who could have taken the moment and worn it, did the thing instead that made the 2 of them, against every law of small-town nature. "Friends for 30 years, she said. Your smoke is too warm and your salt is too quick. Come Tuesday and bring your grandmother's counts if you have them." And the fur collar came Tuesday, with a copybook older than the county, and went home at dusk with her counts corrected in Liesel's printed hand, and at Christmas there arrived at the Marsh place a ham cured to the mended recipe, the first the woman had gotten right in 20 years of trying, with a card that said in a proud angular hand, "The middle held." She told that story all her life. The stock buyer's wife did. Told it on herself, at her own table, wearing the fur collar, and the telling of it did more to finish the town's turning than the blue ribbon ever had. because a ribbon proves a stranger is skilled, but a neighbor standing in your kitchen telling on her own vanity proves the stranger has become one of you. And that, Ott observed to his dog in German, was the fair's real premium, though the dog, he admitted, had heard it first from him back in November. Gideon's part in the fair was quieter and came out only years later, in the way of that marriage, which kept its tenderness the way the smokehouse kept its fire, banked and out of the wind. It came out that on the first evening of the fair, before the judging, he had gone alone to the premium table under the canvas after the crowds thinned, and stood a while in front of the 12 anonymous hams in the lantern light, and that the fair board member on watch, old Peavy, had asked him if he could pick his wife's out of the dozen, and that Gideon had looked at them all and said, "I could pick it out of 1,000, and Peavy, testing him covering the entry cards with his hat, had said, "Go on then," and Gideon had walked the table once and put his hand on the marsh ham without a second's pause, and Peavy asked him how, what mark he knew it by, and Gideon Marsh stood there in the lantern light with his hand on the winter's work, the norther, the salt, the 3 in the morning lantern, the ice groaning under the wheels at the Smoky Hill crossing, all of it sewn up in muslin under his palm, and said the only thing there was to say, which Peavy repeated at the barber shop for years, he said, the same way you know your own house in the dark. The second winter was the proving winter. Because anyone can be a story once, and Liesel knew better than anybody that the Corbin contract held only for as long as the quality held as sampled, and she went at that second season like a general who has won a battle and refuses on principle to enjoy it. The killing time that November took 9 days instead of 4, with Ott and the Meeks girl and 2 hired men from town, men who a year before would have laughed at the wages of the Marsh place and now asked around at Feeney's whether there might be work out there, and the smokehouse ran full from December clear into April, and a second smokehouse went up beside it in March, built of squared logs to her drawing, with the draft designed into it from the sill up, and Gideon, setting the ridgepole, called down that they were now a town of 2 buildings, and asked what she meant to name it, and she looked at the 2 of them standing together in the snow, the old and the new, the inherited and the built, and did not laugh, and that evening she wrote to the stencil maker in Kansas City, and when the crates began going out on the Santa Fe cars that spring, they went with 2 words burned black on the pine, Marsh Smokehouse, and under it, smaller, Barrow Creek, Kansas, and that was the name. There was never any question of another. It was his land and her craft, and both names were inside the one-word Marsh anyway, which is the arithmetic of a real marriage. The trade grew the way sound things grow, by its own weight. Corbin doubled his standing order the second year and tripled it the third, and the Corbin house began printing a line on its bill of fare, Marsh Ham, Barrow Creek, which travelers read at 40 miles an hour across the middle of the continent, and some of those travelers were hotel men and commissary agents and wholesale grocers, because everyone eats, and the letters started coming, first a trickle, then steadily, from Salina and Topeka and Kansas City, from a hotel in Denver, from a mining company in Colorado that wanted hams by the hundredweight for men working a mile above the sensible earth, and by the 4th year the Marsh place was buying hogs as well as raising them, taking the corn-fed best from farms in 3 counties at prices posted plainly on Feeney's wall, weighed on certified scales in the open yard where any seller could watch the beam, which detail Liesel never once in 40 years let anyone talk her out of, and the neighbors who sold to her got more for their hogs than Vane had ever paid, and knew exactly why, and said so, and the saying of it was worth more to Gideon than the money. He had gone from the man the county was quietly waiting to bury to the man the county pointed out to visitors. And he wore it the way he wore everything, without noise. But Liesel would catch him sometimes of an evening, standing at the yard gate looking down the lane at the wagons coming in loaded at hog buying time, 3 and 4 in line, dust hanging gold in the light. And she knew what he was looking at, because she looked at it too. He was looking at the same lane he had driven her up in the November dark bride and salt barrel on the same bill of lading, the year everything was cracking and letting go. The town's memory reorganized itself around the new facts, as towns' memories do. Within a few years there was hardly a soul in Barrow Creek who would admit to having stood on that platform and pitied anybody. And the story as the county told it slowly became the story of how they had all known from the first that the German bride was something remarkable. And Liesel let them have that too, because she had gotten what she needed, which was not their memory, but their scales, their fair prices, their children coming to her smokehouse to learn a trade. Over the years she trained 11 of them, farm sons and farm daughters both, hands over hands in the brine saying the counts out loud, and 2 of those went off and started smokehouses of their own, one at Great Bend and one clear in Nebraska, and she sent each of them away with a set of certified weights for a parting gift, which tells you the whole of her better than any speech could. There were children of their own, 3, a daughter first, Anna, born the 2nd September, and then 2 sons, Carl and young Gideon. And the house that had been finished and quiet filled up with noise and mending and German and English braided together in one family grammar, the children scolding the dog in one language and confessing at bedtime in the other. And Anna grew up to keep the books and then to run the whole trade side better than either parent, with Corbin himself gone gray by then, standing in the yard one autumn telling Gideon that the girl drove a harder bargain than her mother, which Gideon reported at supper as the finest compliment the family had ever received. And there was an argument at that supper about whether it was, which was the kind of argument that House specialized in, loud and laughing and settling nothing. Ott Kruger lived to hold all 3 children, a bent old man in the same chair by the same stove every Sunday of his last years, telling them the story of the train platform with improvements each time, until in the final version he had known the whole future at first sight and possibly arranged it. And when he died, in the January of 1895, quietly, in his own bed with his boots cleaned and set square by the door, they buried him in the churchyard at Barrow Creek, and Liesel put on his stone, under his name, a line in German that the stone cutter charged double for, and the county puzzled over for a generation. It said, "He brought turnips," and was a friend, and if you do not understand why a woman would pay double to say that in granite, then you have never been a stranger in a far country the second morning, answering a knock at the door. The years went by the way good years go, which is to say fast, and mostly unrecorded, because happiness keeps a thin ledger. There were bad patches, there always are. The drought of 984 when they fed the herd on thistle, hay, and nerve. A fire in the 2nd smokehouse one August that they caught in time because Liesel smelled wrong smoke at 200 yards the way a banker smells a bad signature. The winter Carl took the diphtheria and lived. The spring young Gideon took a notion for the sea, of all things, a boy from the exact middle of a continent, and went and wrote home rarely, and came back at 30 with a wife from Galveston and no explanations, and was welcomed with none demanded. Because Liesel Brandt had once gotten off a train herself with her whole story folded out of sight in a trunk, and had built her life on the mercy of not being asked for it all at once. Gideon and Liesel grew old in the house they had nearly lost, and they grew old well, which is a skill like any other, mostly made of not keeping score. And every year on the 26th of March, the day the note was paid, they observed a private ceremony that the children knew about and pretended not to. Gideon would take the old mortgage release out of the family Bible and read it aloud at the kitchen table all the way through in a lawyer voice that got more solemn and more terrible as the years went on, and Liesel would laugh until she had to hold the table every single year at the exact same performance. And if you want to know what a good marriage is made of, it is made of that one joke, kept alive for 40 years, tended like a fire, never once allowed to go out. He died in the October of 1922 at 78, in his own bed with the window open to the smell of the pens and the cottonwoods, having spent the morning at the yard gate watching the wagons come in. And his last words, which Anna wrote down, were not solemn. He looked at Liesel sitting beside him with her hand in his and said, "You never did tell me what was in the letter you wrote that agency." And Liesel said, "I told them I was willing to work." And he smiled and said, understated, and died the way he had lived, without noise, holding the strongest hand he had ever held. Liesel outlived him 9 years, upright to the last, walking the Smokehouse rows every morning with her cane and her nose, overruling her grandchildren on matters of hickory with total success, and she died in the February of 1931 at 74 in the middle of the season, with the smoke going, which everyone agreed was exactly as she would have ordered it, and they are buried side by side in the churchyard at Barrow Creek under one wide stone, not far from Ott and his turnips. And the Smokehouse went on without them, because that is what she had built it to do. Anna's sons ran it, and then their sons, and the crates went out on the trucks when the trains gave way, with the same 2 words burned on the pine. And if you had stood in the yard of the Marsh Place on any winter evening in all those years, when the light was going purple over the stubble and the lamps were coming on in the house, and the thin, patient smoke was standing up straight from the smokehouse chimney into the cold, you would have seen the whole story in one look, because that was all it ever was. Finally, a woman who knew a thing all the way to the bottom. A man who gave her the room to know it, and the smoke rising slow and sure over the flat, dark country, feeding, as the saying went in that county for 60 years, half of Kansas, which was an exaggeration but not by much, and earned, which is the only kind of exaggeration worth having. The wind still comes out of the northwest at Barrow Creek in November. The trains still run an hour late, and the smoke still rises.